Staying on the UFC front, more antitrust lawsuits have been filed. Music to everyone's ears. So these would be the third and fourth antitrust suits filed against the UFC. The first one being the Kung Lee case that covered fighters from the end of 2010 through the end of June 2017. Then there was the Cajun Johnson-led case covering UFC fighters from July 1st of 2017 up to the present. So on May 23rd, Toronto resident himself, Misha Cirkunov, filing a antitrust suit against the UFC, and this is representing fighters in the Cajun Johnson class of fighters that have signed. They have signed waiver agreements and arbitration clauses in their contracts, which would prevent them from.
I love arbitration clauses.
Yes. Tell me if this sounds familiar. That they will have to argue whether these arbitration clauses can be held up or not. So the argument from Cirkunov is that these should be thrown out. They go against both federal and Nevada law, and that if successful, then those fighters that sign these clauses, they would be able to be part of the Johnson case. And if there is a judgment or a settlement, they would reap in those rewards as well, which as of now, they would not. The other case, which is to me, a really interesting one, is led by Phil Davis, who was a former UFC fighter, went to Bellator, now fights for the PFL, and he is representing all non-UFC fighters since May the 29th of 2021 that are not part of either the Johnson or Cirkunov cases, and they aren't seeking any money. All they are looking for is injunctive relief, where this is arguing that fighters outside of the UFC have also been damaged by these practices by the UFC by having such a stranglehold on the top fighters and restricting their ability to have fights outside of the UFC with similar competitive talent. And they're seeking changes to the UFC contracts, including a provision that would allow all UFC fighters to be on 1-year annual contracts with the UFC, and then your deal would be up, and you could assess if you want to resign, if you want to test free agency. But you would have 1-year periods where you are assigned to the UFC, and then you make that decision in your career. And as a caveat to this, John Nash, who does have a story on the Uncrowned site on Yahoo about this, he was also in the courtroom on Tuesday as they were having a hearing regarding these cases. And who has been assigned to oversee these cases? Judge Richard Boulware, the same man who was assigned to the previous Kung Lee and Cajun Johnson cases. So this is Richard Boulware's wheelhouse. And I think this man is a bane of the UFC's existence that has so far.
High school classmate of Dana White.
That is correct. Yeah, these two are not getting together at the high school reunion with the Fertittas. And the Kung Lee case has ended with a $375 million settlement. The Cajun Johnson suit is ongoing, and now you add these two. John Nash also noted in his story, the fact that Phil Davis's suit is not seeking monetary damages in all of this, it could speed up the process pretty dramatically. So that's something to watch as well. I don't know how likely any of these are. One is sort of just, it's the argument we've talked about in the Janelle Grant case and other ones, Brandon. It comes down to, are these arbitration and waiver clauses, can they be thrown out or not? It's going to come down to that interpretation. And then in the Phil Davis case, I think it gets very granular. I see the UFC fighting that one tooth and nail. Like, they do not want to disrupt their standard boilerplate contracts and the amount of control that having these fighters under multiple year deals has in terms of their favor, and how much of a change this would be for the industry if you could have all of your fighters. This would be like New Japan, where every January, pretty much all the contracts are up at the same time, and you could just test your free agency out there, and would give a lot of incentive to other promotions that if you could raise capital, you could at least go after some of the top fighters every year when their deals come up.
I don't want to look at the stock price. It doesn't seem like the stock price has reacted dramatically to this, right? So these are filed on the 23rd and the 29th, and it doesn't look like there have been huge moves in the stock in the last several days over the course of these lawsuits being filed. But anyway, so if I'm understanding this right, the Cirkunov suit is basically saying you as a reaction to these prior to the Johnson and the Lee cases, you've put arbitration clauses into everyone's contracts to try to make sure this never happens again. You've put clauses in the contracts to say you can't be part of a class action lawsuit. And Cirkunov is coming forward to say, no, let's get rid of this and give me money because of the damage that you've done to me. And then the Davis case is basically, as you said, is not seeking any monetary compensation. It's just saying we want the contracts changed so that you can't have such control of the fighters. And there's also some issues raised about fighters were often not given title matches until they would agree to resigning with the company.
Exactly. Like there were certain situations where you would, and there were very few of them. Like BJ Penn comes to mind in 2004, where here he becomes a champion and then goes to fight in K1 afterwards. Like they would make sure your champion could not leave. And where this ties in, maybe a more recent example is Francis Ngannou was the UFC heavyweight champion, and he had a sunset clause built into his contract where no matter what, once the terms of this deal were fulfilled, he was a free agent, even if he was the heavyweight champion, which he was, and got to leave. And this was a big deal because this just did not happen, where a UFC heavyweight champion, the top heavyweight in the sport, got to leave as champion. But the problem was, he goes to the PFL, and his big fights have been in boxing. He's not had anything meaningful in the PFL. And that's what Davis is arguing, is that even if you slip through the cracks and get to leave the UFC, Francis Ngannou has no one to fight that would make it worth PFL's while to be able to reap in the benefit. Like, we're going to spend all this money on Francis Ngannou. We need big fights to bring to this guy, and we can't because the UFC has such a monopoly on the top fighters who cannot get out of these contracts. Even if we were willing to outbid the UFC, we can't even get to the table and negotiate with them. So there's damage being done to your Francis Ngannou's even outside of the UFC. Whether that's an argument that a judge is going to have sympathy for remains to be seen. But that is what the Phil Davis case is trying to argue about, how even people outside of the UFC are feeling the effects of UFC's control because they are less valuable if a promoter cannot put together top fighters in a division and only have access to a very small few that have a name value, are still in their primes as fighters, and can generate some level of revenue, but they need to be matched with other enticing matchups.
And is the notion that if everybody's just on a 1-year contract, everybody will have a lot more flexibility to have big fights outside of UFC?
That's it, is that if you are someone, like let's say you come in on the Ultimate Fighter deal and you sign like some 6-fight deal at a relatively low rate. Well, you can go through, win the Ultimate Fighter, and you have all these fights under this relatively minor deal. And as your contract is increasing, like a lot of fighters, like if they are escalating, the UFC will sometimes sit down and renegotiate a contract to make this fighter happy, but that's all on the discretion of the UFC. This would place more power in the fighter that might come in and roll through, 3 fights in a year, and suddenly his value has increased so much. But rather than have 3 more years under this deal, or X amount of fights that he still owes under these rather small amounts that he has agreed to initially when he was no one, he can reassess after a year, say, hey, my value has grown exponentially. I want to see what the interest is in the market for my services at this time.
This sounds like it would be disadvantageous to UFC, though.
Heavily disadvantaged. Like, this is a great amount of control that they have, that they control all of this. Like, they can hold you to a deal as long as they want, and they can also cut you after any fight. It's exactly like the WWE. You may be, like, if R-Truth wanted out of his contract, and let's say there was a year left in it, WWE has no obligation to let you out of your deal. They'll say, no, you signed a deal. You're going to see the end of it. But the other way around, okay, your contract, let's say there was a year left on it. They could still let him go now. Like, all the power is on the promoter and not for the wrestler or fighter who has to honor the terms to a T. And that latitude is not provided for the promoter that can exit their contract with a 90-day no-compete. Or in the case of the UFC, they can just cut you outright. Like, they don't need cause to fire you.
But that's good for investors, though. It's good for UFC. It's good for the value of the company.
Well, these are not
Why would anybody
investors
wanna
that are
ruin that?
fighting. That have these fighters also have no stock in TKO either, to my knowledge. So that is not a relevant party that they are concerned for or arguing on their behalf. Yeah, and it is worth noting, Eric Kramer is the same lawyer that is representing both Cirkunov and Davis in these cases. He was also involved in the other antitrust cases, so that's a key legal figure that is behind these cases.
These lawsuits
as well.
are definitely related. Same
Yes.
attorney, yeah.